You want to find interesting stories. Would you like to break down brick walls and make progress with your research when church records are lost or just don't give you enough information? Well, for many years, Emma and I have been helping people access Court of Session records, which can fill in the gaps. And we're delighted to announce the first phase of our Court of Session Records Index. Now, the Court of Session is the highest civil court in Scotland, although it should be said there's a further right of appeal to the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. The records are held by the National Records of Scotland, and in there we'll find a vast variety of material, cases covering things from divorces right through to bankruptcy. And our index has already got over 600,000 entries, with many more coming soon. So you can search the first batch of records on our website. You can either use the basic search on the homepage or the advanced search, or you can go to the record sets page and then select the dedicated Court of Session Records Index search page, which you can see shown here. So what kind of results are you going to find? Well, you'll find cases touching all aspects of Scottish life. We're just going to look at a few examples which might be especially useful to a genealogist. So one type of case that you may come across involves the appointment of tutors by the court. Now, I should mention here, in this sense, a tutor isn't someone who's going to teach the child something like mathematics or biology, but rather someone who administers the child's legal or financial affairs on their behalf. So maybe if a child's father died, or even both of their parents, this may have become necessary. So in this example here, the court decreed that John Murdoch was to be appointed factor loco tutoris for Robert Webster and Thomas Webster, and curator bonus to William Webster, Janet McCulloch Webster, and Alexander Webster. And those different terms are used there to show that the role was different for the older children. So our index shows the reference both to the decree and the related process. Now, for those of you who searched our Sheriff Court Index, those terms, decree and process, will be familiar. The decree or decreet is the decision of the court, and that often takes the form of a short document of just a page or two. The processes are the paperwork. Now, I should say at least that's the case after 1810. Before that, in the Court of Session, the decrees will be much longer because they include much of the material from the processes. Now, the original records are packed with information. So let's have a quick look at the example that's related to the catalogue entry you just saw. We can see that Alexander Webster died on 25th October 1829 at Madras, and he did not appoint tutors for his children. Also, the children's mother was unable to administer their affairs, so the nearest relatives requested that a solicitor be appointed by the court to do this. Now, interestingly, the nearest relatives on the father's and the mother's sides are named in connection with their legal rights in this matter. And that includes a female, Mrs. Janet McCulloch or Coots. Women are mentioned in these records a lot more than we might imagine. Now, in the pre-1855 era, where it can be a challenge to find records and piece a family together, a document like this can be extremely useful. It links different sides of the family together. It gives us definite information like dates of death, and also will tell us where people were living at the time. And our hope is that records like these can help solve some family mysteries. And we also see many cases relating to financial matters and debts. And this example is for constitution and payment. So in this context, to constitute means to determine or establish a debt in court, and that's usually when the debtor or the original creditor has died. So the pursuer who brought the case is firstly to prove that there was a debt, and then that they had the right to claim its payment. So here we see a summons of constitution and payment. Mrs. Mary Gourley or Harvey, residing in Glasgow, widow of the deceased David Harvey, writer in Glasgow. And it's against Scott and Patrickson merchants in Sligo. So we've already learned quite a lot. By the time of this summons, which was on 31st of January 1833, James Harvey was already dead. Now that in itself could be a great clue, but there's more, because over the page, see that we're actually given the date of death. Now, with so many dates of death being hard to find in this period, that could be just what you need. So how can we locate these? Well, we can search using surname, but also alternative surname, which makes finding women really easy. And as you may know, in Scottish legal records, women are usually recorded under their maiden and married surnames. So let's try searching for another woman in the records, Margaret Farquharson or Fraser. Now we see the result here that there's a decree and a process. So let's look at the decree first. Well, our search result tells us more, that this is a decreet of separation, a mensa et toro, Margaret Farquharson or Fraser against Simon Fraser, tailor in Edinburgh. We also have the date of the decree. Now that information should be enough to identify a couple. What is a decreet of separation, a mensa et toro? Well, effectively, this was the court granting a marital separation. Those words literally mean, from Latin, from table and bed. So it's a separation, but not a divorce. So as with all our indexes, we give you the full reference that you can look at the original in Edinburgh. And that's what we did, so we can look at it now. So here's the original decree. What do we learn? Well, we see that Margaret and Simon had been married in June 1812. They lived together and had 12 children. But then we're told that only 3 are alive. Before 1855, it can be hard to piece together how many children a couple had, especially when infant mortality was so high. We learn that Simon had been getting drunk, and quite bluntly, the record states that Margaret's life has been rendered miserable. Simon was no longer providing for his family, and even taking money from Margaret using violent means. Later in the decree, we learn that Simon had spent some time in prison. Now, although when we research this family in other records, we might discover that Simon and Margaret had separated, this record tells us why, and tells us so much more. We find out even more when we look at the process. And here we have extracts from the police court relating to Simon's criminal convictions. Now, sometimes the original criminal court records have been lost, so extracts like this can really help us fill the gaps. So as well as records pertaining to separation, the Court of Session is the place to go for Scottish divorce records between 1830 and 1984. So finally, let's look at an older record. So here we have an index entry for the process relating to a decreet or decree, Brown versus Maxwell from 1668. This is what it looks like. So in the process, we learn that the defender's father became indebted to the pursuer's father nearly 30 years before the date of this case. And when we look at the documents, we discover details of the relationships and dates involved, which would be a great find if you're researching either of those families. So as with all of our record sets, we've more information in our learning zone. So dive in and see what you can find. If you're working with older records, you'll need to learn how to read the writing and understand them. So a reading list in the conference handout will point you in the right direction of some resources to sharpen your research skills.